The grey autumn afternoon settled over Thornfield Manor like a shroud, its diffused light filtering through the tall windows of the third-floor schoolroom with a quality almost ethereal, almost sorrowful, as though the very air mourned something long lost. Miss Eleanor Hartwell stood beside the worn mahogany desk, her dove-grey dress carefully mended at the cuffs where the fabric had begun to fray, a perfect complement to the melancholic atmosphere that pervaded this ancient house. The scent of approaching rain mingled with the dusty perfume of old books, creating an olfactory landscape of faded gentility and quiet resignation. Before her sat Lady Catherine Ashford, a child of 8 years with solemn dark eyes that seemed far too grave for one so young, her small fingers tracing the words of a French primer with dutiful concentration. Eleanor watched the child with a tenderness she struggled to contain within the bounds of professional propriety, recognizing in Catherine's carefully controlled composure the same protective armor she herself had learned to wear, the shield of those who have known loss and learned that displays of need invite only further injury. "Très bien, Lady Catherine," Eleanor murmured, her voice soft as the rain now beginning to patter against the window panes. "Your pronunciation improves daily." The child's lips curved in the smallest of smiles, a rare and precious thing in this house where joy seemed to have been banished along with light and laughter. Eleanor's own smile in return felt like a fragile creature taking tentative flight, and she was suddenly, painfully aware of how little she had to offer this lonely child. Beyond patience and whatever knowledge remained from her own carefully cultivated education, an education meant to prepare her for drawing rooms and society, not for the quiet servitude of a governess's life. The sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond caused both their heads to turn, and Eleanor's breath caught as the tall figure of the Duke of Thornfield passed the open doorway, his profile stern and remote as a marble monument. Sebastian Ashford, 9th Duke of Thornfield, moved through his ancestral home like a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life, his dark coat immaculate, his bearing rigid with the discipline of a man who has forgotten how to bend lest he break entirely. He did not look into the schoolroom, he never looked, as though the sight of his daughter's careful studies might pierce whatever ice encased his heart. But Eleanor felt the cold draught of his passing nonetheless, the way one feels the shadow of a great bird passing overhead. Catherine's small hand had stilled on her primer, her eyes fixed on the empty doorway through which her father had disappeared, and Eleanor saw in that frozen moment the truth of this place. A house inhabited by 3 souls, each locked in their separate chambers of grief and diminishment, each afraid to reach across the dark spaces between them. The rain intensified, drumming now against the windows with insistent melancholy, and Eleanor returned her attention to the lesson, pushing away thoughts of what she herself had lost, of the life that should have been hers, of the scandal that had reduced her from Miss Hartwell of Hartwell House to Miss Hartwell the governess, dependent on the charity of distant relations and the cold comfort of employment in a house that felt less like a home than a beautiful hollow mausoleum. As Catherine bent over her arithmetic slate, carefully forming the numbers Eleanor had demonstrated, the governess found her mind drifting a dangerous indulgence she usually disciplined away, but today the grey light and the sound of rain seemed to dissolve her defences, and she was suddenly, unwillingly, transported back 2 years to another autumn afternoon, to the church at Hartwell Village, where she had stood in her mother's carefully altered wedding gown, orange blossoms woven through her hair, her heart so full of hope and innocent certainty that she had felt she might ascend like some heavenly creature. Charles Pemberton, handsome, charming Charles with his easy promises and honeyed words, had seemed the answer to every prayer, the salvation of her family's declining fortunes through his modest but respectable income, and more than that, she had believed herself genuinely loved, had believed in the devotion he proclaimed so eloquently in his letters. But Charles had not appeared at the altar that morning. Instead, his brother had arrived with a note, a coward's note, brief and brutal, explaining that an opportunity had arisen to marry Miss Victoria Ashworth, whose father's railways had made him one of the wealthiest men in England, and that Charles hoped Eleanor would understand that practical considerations must sometimes supersede sentiment. The collective gasp of the assembled guests, the pitying looks that had felt like physical blows, her mother's stifled sob, her father's face grey with humiliation and rage, these memories lived in Eleanor's body like shrapnel, small, sharp pieces of shame that shifted and cut with every breath. The scandal had been immediate and devastating. Jilted at the altar, the whispers said, cast aside for a richer bride. Obviously there must have been some deficiency in her, some failing that had caused her fiancé to flee. Her family, already struggling with her father's poor investments and accumulated debts, found themselves suddenly unable to show their faces in society. Invitations drying up like streams in drought, former friends crossing streets to avoid acknowledging them. Within 6 months, her father had died, some said of a broken heart, though the doctor called it apoplexy, and within a year, the creditors had taken Hartwell House, leaving Eleanor and her mother dependent on the grudging charity of distant cousins who made clear at every opportunity that they were burdens barely tolerated. Employment had been necessity, not choice, and even that had required her mother's cousin's intervention, a letter of reference that glossed over the scandal and emphasized Eleanor's accomplished education. And so she had come to Thornfield Manor, grateful for even this diminished existence, this life of service in the shadowed corners of someone else's grand house, teaching someone else's child, eating her solitary meals from trays carried up back staircases by servants who would never consider her their equal nor quite their better. Miss Hartwell? Catherine's small voice broke through the bitter reverie, and Eleanor looked down to find the child watching her with those two knowing eyes. You seemed very far away. Are you quite well? Eleanor summoned a smile, touched despite herself by the concern in that young face, and replied with gentle firmness, Quite well, dear child. I was merely contemplating how best to explain the principles of multiplication. Shall we continue? The Duke of Thornfield entered the schoolroom precisely 3 days after Eleanor had begun her employment, his presence announced by the subtle shift in atmosphere that accompanies those who wield absolute authority within their domain, and Eleanor felt her spine straighten reflexively, every instinct honed by her fall from grace, now alerting her to the necessity of perfect propriety, perfect competence, perfect invisibility. Miss Hartwell, he said, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to resonate in the austere room, I trust you will not object to my observing this morning's instruction. It was not truly a question, and Eleanor recognized it as such, responding with a deferential incline of her head and a murmured, Of course, Your Grace. Lady Catherine and I were just beginning our history lesson. Sebastian Ashford moved to stand near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the grey light, his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude of rigid formality, and Eleanor was acutely conscious of his scrutiny as she guided Catherine through the lesson on the Norman conquest, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The Duke's face remained impassive, carved from marble it seemed, beautiful in the way monuments are, beautiful, cold, remote, eternally separate from the warm chaos of human feeling. And yet Eleanor observed the way his eyes softened almost imperceptibly when they rested on his daughter, the only crack in his formidable armor. Catherine, who had been so responsive and engaged in their previous lessons, became stilted and overly careful in her father's presence, her small voice barely above a whisper, and Eleanor ached for the child who so clearly yearned for paternal warmth yet received only distant approval. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, the Duke spoke again. Lady Catherine, you may take a quarter-hour's respite in the nursery. I wish to speak with Miss Hartwell regarding your curriculum. The child departed with a curtsy that was heartbreakingly perfect in its execution, leaving Eleanor alone with her formidable employer, and she clasped her hands before her to still their trembling, meeting his gaze with as much composure as she could summon. Your Grace, she prompted when the silence stretched thin. My daughter's progress, you find her attentive? Capable? His questions were terse, efficient, betraying nothing of his thoughts. Lady Catherine is exceptionally intelligent and diligent, Your Grace. She possesses a natural aptitude for languages and shows particular sensitivity to literature. Eleanor paused, then added with careful diplomacy, She is perhaps somewhat reserved in her manner, but I believe with patience and encouragement she may grow more confident in expressing herself. Something flickered across the Duke's features, pain perhaps, or recognition, but it vanished so quickly, Eleanor thought she might have imagined it. His gaze moved to the portrait hanging above the mantelpiece, a beautiful woman with Catherine's dark eyes and a serene smile, the late Duchess frozen forever in oils and varnish, and Eleanor saw how his jaw tightened, how he deliberately turned away, as though the sight inflicted some unbearable wound. Continue as you have been, Miss Hartwell, he said, his voice rougher now, abraded by some emotion he would not name. "Catherine needs—" He paused, and for a moment Eleanor glimpsed something raw and lost in his expression before the ducal mask reasserted itself. "She needs steadiness, consistency, someone who will not leave her." The words hung between them, weighted with meanings Eleanor could only partly grasp, and she found herself responding with quiet conviction, "I shall endeavor to provide exactly that, Your Grace." He nodded once, a sharp, conclusive gesture, and strode from the room without another word, leaving Eleanor standing in the grey light, her heart beating strangely, surrounded by the pervasive grief that seemed to seep from the very walls of Thornfield Manor like damp. Weeks passed in the quiet rhythm of lessons and routines, the autumn deepening into richer golds and crimsons beyond the schoolroom windows, and Eleanor found herself gradually, almost imperceptibly, building a bridge to the silent, watchful child who had initially seemed as remote and guarded as the manor itself. Patience, Eleanor had learned through her own suffering, was not merely the absence of haste, but rather an active practice of presence and of showing up day after day with steady kindness, regardless of response. And she applied this hard-won wisdom to Catherine, never forcing conversation or intimacy, but simply offering herself as a reliable constant in the child's uncertain world. They established small rituals, morning readings from poetry before formal lessons began, afternoon walks in the garden when weather permitted, evening reviews of the day's accomplishments where Eleanor praised genuine effort rather than perfection. Gradually, imperceptibly, Catherine's rigid posture softened, her monosyllabic responses expanded into sentences, her watchful wariness gave way to something resembling trust, and Eleanor felt a fierce protective tenderness growing in her chest, a sense that perhaps her ruined life might yet contain purpose if she could offer this lonely child the steadiness and affection she so desperately needed. The breakthrough came on a grey Thursday afternoon during their literature lesson, when Eleanor was reading aloud from Time's A Midsummer Night's Dream *, performing the voices with perhaps more theatrical enthusiasm than strict Governess propriety allowed. Giving Bottom's transformed braying such ridiculous emphasis that she nearly made herself laugh, and then suddenly, miraculously, Catherine laughed, a genuine peal of surprised delight that seemed to startle the child as much as it astonished Eleanor, and for a moment they simply stared at each other before Catherine laughed again, her small face transformed by joy, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the sheer beauty of that sound. In the corridor beyond the closed door, the Duke of Thornfield paused mid-stride, his hand arrested halfway to the doorknob, and stood motionless as his daughter's laughter, a sound he had not heard in the 3 years since his wife's death, a sound he had feared might be lost forever, rippled through the heavy silence of the manor, like sunlight breaking through clouds, and something in his chest that had been frozen solid began, painfully, to crack. Inside the schoolroom, unaware of her audience, Eleanor seized the momentum of the moment, and when the lesson concluded, she produced paper and charcoal, suggesting Catherine might like to sketch her favorite scene from the play, and watched with growing amazement as the child's careful, precise hand rendered Titania's bower with surprising artistic sensitivity, the lines confident and expressive in a way Catherine's words rarely were. "Catherine, this is remarkable," Eleanor breathed, genuinely impressed, and the child glanced up with something fragile and hopeful in her expression, asking in a near whisper, "Do you truly think so, Miss Hartwell?" And Eleanor responded with absolute conviction, "I do, dear child. You have a gift, a way of seeing beauty and translating it onto paper. This is something precious, something to be nurtured and celebrated." Catherine's smile, small but genuine, felt like a victory more significant than any Eleanor had achieved in her former life, and as she carefully set the drawing aside to be preserved, she thought that perhaps this quiet making of difference in one small life might be enough to redeem her own story's painful chapters, might be purpose enough for a woman the world had deemed ruined and unworthy. And in that moment, Eleanor felt something she had not experienced since standing jilted at the altar. She felt needed, valued, and despite everything she had lost, strangely grateful for where circumstance had delivered her. Eleanor descended the main staircase long after the household had retired, her single candle casting wavering shadows on the paneled walls, moving through the silent corridors with the careful stealth of one who knows herself to be transgressing invisible boundaries. for servants and governesses occupied that ambiguous territory between servant and family, were not meant to wander the principal rooms after dark. Yet she desperately needed a volume of poetry to complete tomorrow's lesson on the Romantics, and the schoolroom's limited collection had proven inadequate. The library door stood ajar, a sliver of golden light spilling into the darkened hallway, and Eleanor's heart sank with the realization that she was not alone in her nocturnal wandering, her first instinct being to retreat before discovery. But curiosity, or perhaps fate, stilled her flight, and she pushed the door open wider, stepping into the magnificent room with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and the scent of leather and old paper and beeswax. The Duke of Thornfield sat at the massive oak desk, still dressed but disheveled in a way she had never witnessed, his cravat loosened, his dark hair disordered as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, and he was surrounded by correspondence, letters and documents spread in chaotic profusion, his head in his hands, in an attitude of such profound weariness that Eleanor's breath caught, for this was not the imposing, controlled aristocrat who moved through his manner like a cold wind, but rather a man besieged by burdens he could not escape. "Your Grace," she said softly, prepared to apologize and withdraw, but he looked up with eyes that were hollowed and red-rimmed, and for a moment he seemed not to recognize her, lost in whatever private torment the correspondence had conjured. "Miss Hartwell," he said at last, his voice rough and unguarded. "Forgive me. I did not expect, that is, I thought myself alone." Eleanor should have made her excuses and departed. Propriety demanded nothing less, yet something in his expression, a desperate loneliness that mirrored her own, compelled her to remain. "I came seeking a book for tomorrow's lesson," she explained, then added with careful gentleness, "but I can return another time if you prefer solitude." He gestured toward the shelves with a weary hand. "Take what you need. The books, at least, have no expectations, no demands they press upon one." There was such bitter exhaustion in his tone that Eleanor found herself moving closer, drawn by an instinct she could not name. "Your Grace, forgive my presumption, but you seem... that is, might I be of any assistance?" He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Unless you can resurrect the dead or turn back time, I think not, Miss Hartwell." The silence stretched between them, and then, and as though some dam had broken, he continued, "My wife died 3 years ago this month. Childbirth. The infant survived mere hours, and I have discovered that grief does not diminish with time so much as one simply becomes better at performing normalcy around it." Eleanor's throat tightened with recognition, with the understanding that comes from having oneself been intimate with loss. "I think," she said quietly, moving to stand before the desk, her candle illuminating her face in the dimness, "that we are never taught how to live with grief, only how to hide it, and perhaps that is the greater tragedy, that we must suffer in isolation rather than acknowledging that sorrow is simply love's other face." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition perhaps that she spoke not from platitude but from experience. "You have known loss," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I have known the death of a life I expected to live," Eleanor replied, then added with quiet honesty, "which is not the same as losing a beloved person, but is perhaps a distant cousin to that particular grief." The Duke nodded slowly, and for several minutes they remained thus, two wounded souls regarding each other across the desk's paper-strewn surface, and Eleanor felt the strange intimacy of shared understanding, the recognition that beneath the vast gulf of social position, pain made equals of all. "I have forgotten how to live beyond duty," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I perform the role of father, of duke, of master of this estate, but I cannot remember what it feels like to simply be." Eleanor's heart ached for him, and she offered the only comfort she possessed. "Perhaps that is enough for now, Your Grace. Perhaps simply continuing, simply showing up each day for those who depend upon you, is itself a form of courage. And perhaps someday the performance becomes real again, becomes life rather than mere survival." Something in his face softened, and he regarded her with an expression she could not quite decipher before the ducal mask reasserted itself, and propriety returning like armor donned. "You are wise beyond your years, Miss Hartwell," he said, his tone formal once more. "Take your book and return to your rest. Morning comes too quickly." Eleanor curtsied and selected her volume with trembling hands, and as she departed the library, She felt the weight of his gaze upon her back, and knew that something had shifted between them in that late-night encounter. Some boundary had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and she carried that knowledge with her into the darkness like a candle flame cupped against the wind. As autumn deepened into its richest and most melancholic phase, the trees beyond the schoolroom windows blazing with crimson and gold before their inevitable surrender to winter's bareness, Eleanor noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in the rhythms of Thornfield Manor, a warming that began the morning after their library encounter, when the Duke appeared at the schoolroom door during Catherine's geography lesson, not with his usual observational distance, but with a tentative quality that suggested actual interest rather than mere paternal duty. He asked Catherine about her studies, and when the child enthusiastically explained the map she was creating, he knelt beside her chair to examine her work more closely, offering genuine praise that made Catherine's face luminous with pride, and Eleanor felt something dangerous flutter in her chest at the sight of this powerful man made gentle by love for his daughter. The visits became more frequent, no longer announced by the housekeeper but casual, as though the Duke had claimed the right to enter this domestic sphere that had previously existed separate from his austere governance of the estate, and gradually his presence shifted from peripheral to participatory. He suggested texts for their literary studies, debated with Eleanor about pedagogical approaches with surprising intellectual engagement, even joined their nature walks when weather permitted, pointing out architectural features of the estate, or telling Catherine stories about the land's history that brought both past and place alive. Then came the small gestures, each one unremarkable in isolation, but accumulating into a pattern that Eleanor could not help but notice even as she told herself she must not interpret, must not hope. A superior lamp appeared in the schoolroom one grey morning, replacing the inadequate candle that had strained her eyes during winter's early twilights. And when she thanked him, he merely said he could not have his daughter's education compromised by poor lighting, but his eyes held hers a moment longer than necessity required. He began asking her opinion not merely about Catherine's lessons, but about the child's emotional state, her development, her needs, treating Eleanor not as a servant, implementing his instructions, but as a partner in Catherine's raising, and she found herself speaking with an honesty and authority she had not dared claim in any interaction since her fall from grace. One afternoon, as she was returning from the village with books she had purchased with her meager salary, she encountered him in the hallway and mentioned needing to wait until evening to access the library, not wishing to presume, and he had looked genuinely surprised before saying with something almost like warmth, "Miss Hartwell, please consider the library freely available to you at any hour. A mind such as yours should not be constrained by arbitrary schedules." And she had felt simultaneously elevated and endangered by such regard. Eleanor knew she should maintain strict professional distance, should recognize these gestures as simple kindness from a decent employer, and nothing more. Yet she could not prevent the treacherous blooming of feeling in her guarded heart, the way her pulse quickened when she heard his footsteps in the corridor, the way she found herself dressing with slightly more care each morning, the way his occasional smile felt like sunlight breaking through years of grey. She told herself sternly that such feelings were not merely inappropriate but dangerous, that she was a governess in his employ, a woman whose reputation was already destroyed, and any fantasy of regard beyond professional respect was both foolish and potentially catastrophic to the fragile security she had managed to construct from the ruins of her former life. Yet knowing the danger did not prevent the feeling, and she lay awake in her small room, listening to the autumn wind, strip leaves from the trees, and wondering whether it was possible to die from wanting what one could never, must never, hope to possess. The invitation arrived not through the housekeeper's formal channels, but directly from the Duke himself, who appeared at the schoolroom door one grey afternoon as Eleanor was helping Catherine with her watercolours, and said with a careful formality that nevertheless could not quite disguise an underlying uncertainty, "Miss Hartwell, I wonder if you might consent to dine with Catherine and myself this evening in the small dining room rather than taking your meal in your quarters. It seems absurd that you should eat in isolation when you are so integral to this household's functioning." And Eleanor's heart had performed a complicated maneuver somewhere between her chest and throat, for she understood immediately the significance of such an invitation, the boundary it crossed, the implicit elevation it suggested. She had dressed with trembling hands that evening, her limited wardrobe offering little choice, but she selected her least worn day dress in deep blue, a remnant from her former life that still retained some elegance despite its age. And as she descended to the small dining room, a more intimate space than the grand, formal dining hall, used only by family, she felt acutely conscious of every step, every breath, the way one feels when approaching a precipice whose depth cannot be accurately judged. Catherine was already seated, fairly vibrating with excitement at this disruption of routine, and the Duke stood as Eleanor entered, his courtesy impeccable but his expression betraying something that might have been nervousness in a man less rigidly controlled. And Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, who was overseeing the service, regarded Eleanor with a look of such pointed disapproval that it felt like a physical touch. The meal itself was an exercise in careful navigation, conversation stilted and formal, as though they were strangers, rather than people who had spent increasing amounts of time together, who had shared that moment of vulnerable honesty in the library, who had gradually built something that felt dangerously like connection. Yet the very awkwardness contained its own intimacy, the shared recognition that something significant was occurring beneath the surface of polite exchanges about the weather and Catherine's studies. Catherine chattered happily, delighted to have Eleanor at table, asking questions and telling stories with the unself-conscious ease of a child who does not yet perceive the complex social architecture that governs adult interactions. And gradually her innocent pleasure eased some of the tension, allowed Eleanor and the Duke to speak more naturally, to exchange glances over Catherine's head that carried warmth and shared amusement. Yet Eleanor remained hyper-aware of Mrs. Patterson's presence at the sideboard, of the invisible line she was crossing simply by sitting at this table, of the fact that she was a governess, a paid employee, a woman whose reputation was already destroyed, and whose presence in this space would be noted and judged by every servant in the household. The news likely travelling to the village by morning, more fodder for gossip about the scandalous Miss Hartwell, who had once been jilted at the altar and now presumably had pretensions above her station. But beneath her anxiety ran something else, something she dared not name or examine too closely. The way the Duke looked at her across the candlelit table, not with the distant courtesy of employer to employee, but with something warmer, something that saw her not as a function, but as a person. And when their eyes met over the soup course, she saw in his expression a mirror to the hidden wounds she carried, a recognition that they were both, in their different ways, survivors of losses that had fundamentally altered them, and that perhaps in this strange domestic arrangement they had found something neither had been seeking but both desperately needed, though what that something was, neither dared yet to speak aloud. The necessity of Catherine's new winter boots and various educational supplies brought them to the village on a crystalline November morning, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs and the sky, that particular shade of blue that seems to amplify sound and light, and Eleanor had hoped to complete their errands with quiet efficiency, to remain unnoticed in the crowds that gathered for market day. But fate or cruel providence decreed otherwise, for as she and Catherine emerged from the draper's shop, their arms full of packages, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Charlotte Waverley and Miss Georgiana Thorne, ladies who had once been her intimate friends, who had sat in her family's drawing room and called her Dear Eleanor, and planned their futures together, as though friendship were an immutable force rather than a thing contingent upon social standing and reputation. The recognition in their eyes was immediate and followed just as swiftly by something Eleanor had come to know too well in the 2 years since her ruination, that particular combination of embarrassment and disdain that allowed for intimates to justify their cruelty as righteous propriety, and Mrs. Waverley had actually turned her back, physically pivoting to examine a shop window with exaggerated interest, while Miss Thorne offered a smile of such cutting pity that it felt more violent than outright insult before they both moved away. Skirts deliberately pulled aside as though Eleanor's disgrace might transfer through proximity, and their voices carried back with crystalline clarity, meant to be heard. I cannot fathom what desperation led the Duke to employ such a woman in his household. One can only hope he guards his silver. Her sort cannot be trusted. Eleanor had stood frozen on the cobblestones, her face burning despite the cold, her chest constricted as though someone had pulled stays too tight, and she felt Catherine's small hand slip into hers, felt the child's confusion in the pressure of those fingers, and when she looked down, She saw in Catherine's intelligent eyes the beginning of comprehension that the world contained cruelties she had not yet fully understood. "Miss Hartwell, why did those ladies turn away from you?" Catherine asked with the devastating directness of childhood, and Eleanor had to swallow twice before she could speak, had to force her voice to steadiness, while around them the market continued its indifferent bustle, people passing with averted eyes or curious stares, and she knelt on the cold stones despite the impropriety, bringing herself level with Catherine's troubled face. "Sometimes, my dear, people make judgments about others based on circumstances they do not fully understand," Eleanor said carefully, choosing words that would convey truth without burdening a child with the full weight of society's viciousness. "And sometimes those judgments are unkind, but they reflect more on the judge than on the judged, and we must simply bear them with dignity." What Eleanor did not see, kneeling there in the village street, with Catherine's hand in hers and her own eyes bright with suppressed tears, was the Duke himself emerging from the solicitor's office across the square, his attention caught by the distinctive color of Eleanor's cloak, his expression shifting from mild interest to sharp attention as he observed the scene, witnessed the turned backs, and heard from his position the vicious whispers that continued to swirl around his daughter's governess, and those who happened to glance at his grace in that moment would later report that they had never seen such cold fury in a man's face, a rage all the more terrifying for being utterly controlled. That evening, Eleanor had barely returned to her quarters when Mrs. Patterson summoned her to the drawing room where the Duke stood before the fire, his posture rigid, and he said without preamble, his voice carrying a quality of absolute authority that made even Eleanor straighten instinctively, "Miss Hartwell, it has come to my attention that you were subjected to unconscionable treatment in the village today." And before she could formulate a response, he continued, "I have already taken steps to make clear throughout this household and to certain individuals in the village that you are under my protection and are to be accorded every respect due to a valued member of this family, and should anyone presume to treat you with anything less than courtesy, they will answer to me personally." And Eleanor, looking into his eyes, saw there not pity but a fierce regard that made her heart perform that dangerous maneuver again, and she understood that something fundamental had shifted, that he had chosen to stand as shield between her and the world's judgment, and the implications of that choice were both terrifying and impossibly, dangerously precious. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening, with the kind of biblical fury that seemed to echo some divine judgment, wind howling through the manor's ancient stones like the voices of all Thornfield's ghosts demanding audience, rain lashing against windows with such violence that Eleanor feared the glass might shatter, and for 3 days they were trapped inside, while the world beyond became a grey chaos of water and wind. The isolation of the manor transformed from metaphorical to literal as roads flooded and trees fell, and even the servants spoke in hushed tones about omens and ill fortune. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to concentrate all the unspoken tensions that had been building within those walls, emotions that had been carefully managed through routine and propriety, suddenly finding no outlet in the enforced confinement, and Eleanor felt it pressing against her chest like a physical weight, this awareness that something must soon break. Some crisis must arrive to release the accumulated pressure of all that had passed between her and the Duke, all the charged glances and careful words and boundaries that had been crossed and then anxiously re-established. On the second night of the storm, Catherine woke screaming, her nightmares given terrible power by the violence outside, and Eleanor had gone to her immediately, finding the child sobbing with a depth of terror that suggested these dreams touched something more profound than simple fear of thunder. And gradually, through Catherine's incoherent words, Eleanor understood that the girl dreamed of her mother's death, of being left alone, of everyone she loved disappearing into darkness, and there was nothing Eleanor could do but hold her, rocking slightly in the chair beside Catherine's bed, while the storm raged, and the child clung to her with desperate strength and whispered, "Don't leave me, don't leave me," over and over until the words became a kind of prayer. She must have dozed finally, exhaustion claiming her sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, because she woke to find pale grey light filtering through the curtains, and Catherine asleep against her shoulder, and the child's breathing finally peaceful. And Eleanor was stiff and cold, but did not dare move for fear of waking her. And it was thus that the Duke found them when he entered the room, still in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, as though he too had passed a sleepless night, his face haggard with worry that transformed to relief, and then to something more complicated when he saw them there, in this tableau of comfort that spoke to everything his daughter had been missing, everything he had been unable to provide. She had nightmares, Eleanor whispered, her voice rough with exhaustion, about losing everyone, and she saw something crack in the Duke's carefully maintained composure, saw his throat work as he swallowed hard, and when he spoke his voice was raw with a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. "I am failing her. Miss Hartwell, I am failing her every day, and I do not know how to—" But he could not finish, could only stand there with his defenses finally, utterly breached, and Eleanor, still holding his sleeping daughter, said quietly but with absolute certainty, "You love her, Your Grace, and she knows it, she feels it even when you cannot find words for it, and that love is not failure, it is everything." And for a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the dim room, while the storm finally began to abate outside, and Eleanor felt the dangerous intimacy of this moment, this shared acknowledgement of inadequacy and need, and the strange salvation they had found in each other's presence. Before the Duke seemed to recall himself, straightening with visible effort and retreating behind courtesy's shield once more, but not before she had seen in his eyes something that made her heart both soar and break, the recognition that they were bound now by something that could not easily be undone. The weeks that followed the storm carried a quality of inevitability, as though that night of shared vulnerability had broken some final barrier, and now there could be no retreat to their former careful distance, and the Duke Sebastian, though Eleanor still could not bring herself to think of him by his Christian name, began dining with them each evening, as a matter of course rather than exception, the three of them forming something that resembled a family in all but name, and the conversations that unfolded across candlelit tables grew increasingly personal, moving beyond the safe territories of Catherine's education and household matters into the deeper waters of philosophy and literature and memory. Eleanor discovered that beneath his austere exterior lived a man of considerable wit, whose dry observations about society's absurdities could make her laugh in a way she had not laughed since before her ruin, and she saw too his formidable intelligence, the way he could discuss Plutarch or contemporary politics with equal facility, and more precious still, she witnessed the gradual emergence of his capacity for warmth, the way his eyes would soften when Catherine said something clever, the way his rare smiles transformed his entire countenance from forbidding to almost boyish. One evening in early December, with the first snow falling beyond the windows and the fire crackling in the drawing room where they had retreated after dinner, he had asked her directly about her broken engagement, and Eleanor had felt the familiar tightness in her chest, that instinctive retreat from the wound that had never fully healed. But something in his steady regard gave her courage, and she told him the whole sordid tale, how Thomas Waverley had courted her for 2 years, with every appearance of devoted affection, how the wedding had been planned down to the smallest detail, how she had stood in the church in her mother's altered wedding gown, while the minutes stretched into a quarter hour and then longer, and the whispers began among the assembled guests, and how finally his brother had arrived with a letter explaining that Thomas had eloped to Gretna Green with Miss Sarah Pembridge, whose father had recently inherited a considerable fortune. She described the aftermath with a voice that remained steady through sheer force of will, her father's financial collapse exacerbated by the wedding expenses already incurred, her mother's slow decline into invalidism brought on by shame, the way every door in society had closed to her as though she carried some contagion, and when she finished, she found that tears had traced silent paths down her cheeks, though she had not felt them fall, and she waited for the pity that she had come to dread, the well-meaning sympathy that always made her feel diminished. But Sebastian's response was not pity, it was fury, controlled but absolute, a rage on her behalf that made his voice tight when he said, "Their cruelty reveals their character, not yours, Eleanor." And it was the first time he had used her Christian name, the intimacy of it sending a shock through her system, and he continued, leaning forward with an intensity that held her captive, "That you have survived such betrayal with your kindness and dignity intact speaks to a strength of character that puts to shame every one of those who presume to judge you. And I—" But he stopped himself, seeming to realize he had ventured too far. Yet the unfinished sentence hung between them like a promise, and Eleanor felt something dangerous and precious unfurl in her chest, a hope she knew she should not permit but could no longer entirely suppress. And around them Thornfield Manor seemed to hold its breath while Catherine slept peacefully upstairs. This child, who had become the unexpected bridge between two wounded souls, learning, finally, that they might dare to reach for happiness once more. Eleanor understood with terrible clarity, sometime in the cold December days that followed that fireside confession, that she had fallen irrevocably in love with Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Thornfield, and the recognition came not as joy but as a kind of grief, sharp and relentless as winter wind cutting through inadequate clothing. For what could be more foolish, more dangerous, more utterly without hope than a disgraced governess loving her employer, a man so far above her station that the distance could not be measured in mere social gradations, but in fundamental categories of being, he, a peer of the realm, she, a woman whose name still drew sneers in drawing rooms across 3 counties, he possessed of wealth and title and consequence, she dependent upon his charity for her very bread, and the power imbalance alone rendered any imagined reciprocation not merely unlikely but ethically impossible, for how could he ever speak even if he felt something? Knowing she could not refuse him, could not risk her position, could not afford the luxury of honest refusal. She lay awake through long nights tormented by the cruelty of proximity, forced to witness daily the man he was beneath the ducal reserve, his tenderness with Catherine, his increasing ease in her own company, the way candlelight caught in his dark hair during their evening conversations, the rumble of his rare laughter, the intelligence that sparked in his grey eyes when they debated some point of philosophy or literature, and knowing that all of this was forbidden to her, and that she existed in his life only by his sufferance, and only in the strictly circumscribed role of employee, that to reach for more would be to risk everything, including the fragile sense of purpose she had built here, the love Catherine had come to bear her, the small dignity she had managed to salvage from ruin. She considered leaving, composing resignation letters in her mind during lessons, while Catherine practiced penmanship, imagining herself safely distant in some other household, where her heart would not be hourly broken by the sight of what she could never have. But always she came back to Catherine's face, the trust there, the blossoming confidence, and she knew she could not abandon this child who had already lost so much, could not inflict another wound in service of her own protection, and so she was trapped in this exquisite torture of her own making, and she resolved with something like desperation to reimpose the boundaries that had somehow dissolved, to retreat back into proper professional distance, to armor herself against the dangerous intimacy that had grown between them, like some beautiful invasive vine that would ultimately strangle everything it touched. The weather turned properly bitter in the final weeks before Christmas, frost coating the windows in elaborate patterns that seemed like nature's mockery of her frozen heart, and Eleanor made herself cool and correct in her manner, avoiding the evening drawing-room gatherings when possible, keeping conversation strictly to Catherine's progress and household necessities, building walls around herself with each careful word and averted gaze, even as she felt something precious dying inside her, even as she saw the confusion and then the hurt in Sebastian's eyes when she declined his invitations. Even as winter closed around Thornfield Manor like a fist, and she told herself this was wisdom, this was survival. This was the only possible path for a woman who had already learned too well the price of hoping for what could never be hers. Lady Pemberton arrived on a slate-grey afternoon 3 days before Christmas, her carriage pulling up to Thornfield Manor with all the inevitability of an approaching storm, and Eleanor, watching from the schoolroom window with Catherine beside her, felt a presentiment of disaster even before the elegant woman emerged in a rustle of emerald silk and expensive furs, her posture radiating that particular brand of aristocratic assurance that Eleanor had once moved among, but now could only observe from her diminished position. The Duke's sister swept into the manor with barely concealed purpose, and within an hour the household was transformed by her presence, servants suddenly more formal and watchful, arrangements being made for dinner guests Eleanor had not known were expected, and when Lady Pemberton finally visited the schoolroom, ostensibly to meet her niece, but clearly to assess the governess, Eleanor felt those sharp hazel eyes cataloguing every detail of her person and finding each wanting, the slightly worn but carefully mended dress, the ink stain on her right hand's middle finger, theorness that came from loving both Catherine and Catherine's father beyond what was permitted or wise. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Pemberton said with a smile that held no warmth, "how devoted you are to spend the holidays here rather than with your own family, though I suppose circumstances make that arrangement convenient for all parties." And the delicate emphasis on circumstances made clear she knew precisely the scandal that had driven Eleanor to seek employment, and Eleanor felt that familiar shame crawl up her spine, even as she maintained her composure, and replied evenly that she was grateful for the position and found great reward in Catherine's education. That evening brought the true torture, for Lady Pemberton had brought with her a guest, Miss Arabella Houghton, a young woman of impeccable breeding and considerable beauty, whose family's wealth was matched only by their social prominence. And at dinner, Eleanor understood with sickening clarity that she was witnessing an ambush, an intervention designed to redirect Sebastian toward appropriate matrimonial prospects. And she was forced to sit in her proper place, not quite servant, not quite family, occupying that liminal space that governesses inhabited, while Lady Pemberton steered conversation toward Miss Houghton's accomplishments at the pianoforte, her charitable work, her extensive social connections, all the things that made her a suitable duchess, everything Eleanor could never be. Sebastian appeared miserable throughout the meal, his responses to Miss Houghton's gentle overtures polite but mechanical, and twice his eyes found Eleanor's across the table with an expression that might have been apology or appeal. But Eleanor could not allow herself to interpret, could only force down each bite of food that tasted like ashes, and smile appropriately when Catherine tried to include her in the conversation. And Lady Pemberton's pointed comments about appropriate boundaries, and Catherine requiring a proper mother's guidance, not merely a governess's instruction, landed like blows even as they were delivered with saccharine sweetness, and Eleanor saw with perfect clarity the future that awaited her. Watching Sebastian marry this lovely, suitable woman, becoming irrelevant as a new duchess took her place, perhaps being dismissed entirely or perhaps retained out of pity, which would be worse. And when the dinner finally ended and she could escape to her quarters, she found she was shaking, not with tears, but with the terrible understanding that she had been foolish to hope even briefly that the careful distance she had reimposed might protect her heart, for it was already too late, already lost, and now she would be forced to witness its final destruction in the form of Sebastian's duty-bound marriage to someone who belonged in his world in all the ways Eleanor never could. The crisis came the following afternoon when Catherine, who had been unusually quiet through breakfast, found Eleanor in the schoolroom preparing the day's lessons and asked in a voice so small it barely carried across the room, "Miss Hartwell, are you going to leave me?" And Eleanor felt her heart contract, because she could not bear to lie to this child who had already endured too much loss. And so she set down the grammar text and knelt before Catherine and said gently, "Why would you ask such a thing, darling?" And Catherine's grey eyes, so like her father's, filled with tears as she whispered, "Aunt Pemberton says Papa needs a proper wife, and Miss Houghton keeps talking about how she would redecorate the nursery and hire a French governess, and everyone says it will happen soon, and when Papa marries her you will have to go away because the new Duchess will want her own people, and I cannot lose you too. I cannot. It will be like losing Mama again." And the words tumbled out in an increasingly hysterical rush, until the child was sobbing against Eleanor's shoulder with the kind of desperate fear that could not be reasoned with, only endured, and Eleanor held her and murmured soothing, meaningless sounds, while her own heart shattered, because what could she say? What comfort could she offer when Catherine's fear was entirely justified, when Eleanor herself had lain awake imagining precisely this future? And finally she said with as much steadiness as she could summon, "If your father marries, sweetheart, the new Duchess may indeed prefer a different governess. That is the way of things. But whatever happens, you must know that I love you, and that will never change regardless of where I am." And it was the best truth she could offer. But it was not enough. Catherine's sobs only intensified, and it was thus that Sebastian found them when he entered the schoolroom, having come to discuss some household matter, his face shifting immediately from mild concern to alarm as he took in his daughter's distress and Eleanor's stricken expression. "Catherine, what has happened?" he demanded, crossing the room in 3 strides and dropping to his knees beside them. And Catherine turned to him with all the accusation and terror of childhood and cried, You are going to marry Miss Houghton and send Miss Hartwell away, and I will be alone again." And Sebastian's face went absolutely white, then dark with fury, and he looked at Eleanor over Catherine's head with something blazing in his eyes that she could not name, and he said in a voice of terrible control, "Catherine, listen to me. I am not going to marry Miss Houghton. I am not going to send Miss Hartwell away. Do you understand? No one is leaving." And Catherine hiccuped into his waistcoat, but Aunt Pemberton said, and Sebastian cut her off sharply, "Your aunt is mistaken about a great many things, and I will speak with her directly." And he scooped Catherine into his arms and said to Eleanor, "Stay here, please. I will return shortly." And there was something in his tone that was both command and plea. And then he was gone, with Catherine still clinging to him, and Eleanor heard his boots on the stairs, heard his voice calling for his sister, and then the drawing-room door closing. And she sank into a chair with her hands trembling because something had shifted, some dam had broken, and she did not know whether to hope or despair. 20 minutes later, Sebastian returned alone, his expression carved from stone, and said tersely, "Catherine is resting. Miss Houghton has departed. My sister is packing." And Eleanor stood quickly. "Your Grace, I never meant to cause such disruption if my presence has created difficulties." And he crossed to her and took her hands in his, a liberty that shocked her silent, and said, "Eleanor, you must know." And then the drawing-room door opened and Lady Pemberton stood there, her face white with rage, and she said in a voice like poisoned honey, "Sebastian, we must speak privately about this appalling situation." But Sebastian did not release Eleanor's hands, and his voice was ice as he replied, "There is nothing private about what I have to say. Miss Hartwell has become indispensable to this household and to my daughter's well-being, and any suggestion that she should be dismissed or that I should marry to satisfy your notions of propriety is both unwelcome and unfounded." And Lady Pemberton's eyes narrowed as she looked between them and said, softly, "You care for her, for the governess, Sebastian, the scandal." And Sebastian said with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "I have had quite enough of society's judgments, Amelia, and I find I care not at all what is said in drawing-rooms by people whose opinions have never brought me one moment of happiness." And Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet as Lady Pemberton drew herself up and said, coldly, "Then you are a fool, brother, and I will not stay to watch you destroy yourself," and swept from the room with all the outraged dignity of thwarted will. Sebastian walked the grounds of Thornfield Manor for hours after his sister's carriage disappeared down the drive, his boots crunching through the crusted snow that had fallen overnight, and the winter air burned in his lungs. But he welcomed the sharp clarity it brought because he needed to think, truly think, about what had just transpired and what it meant and where it would lead. And as he walked past the frost-silvered gardens and the bare orchard and the stone wall that marked the eastern boundary of the estate, he found himself retracing not just physical paths, but the emotional journey of the past months. Remembering the man he had been when Eleanor first arrived, a hollow shell moving through prescribed duties, loving his daughter but unable to reach her, bound by grief not for his late wife whom he had respected but never truly loved, their marriage having been one of duty and expectation rather than genuine affection, but grief for the life he had never quite lived, the passion he had never felt, the connection he had believed himself incapable of experiencing. Eleanor had changed everything without his permission or awareness, slipping past his defenses through her quiet competence and unexpected humor, through the way she listened as though his words mattered, through her patient devotion to Catherine that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine care. And he had watched her transform his daughter from a silent ghost of a child into a laughing, curious young person, and somewhere in that witnessing he had fallen entirely and irrevocably in love, not with the idea of replacing what he had lost, but with the specific reality of Eleanor Hartwell, her ink-stained fingers, and her habit of biting her lower lip when concentrating, her fierce intelligence and fiercer loyalty, the courage it had taken to rebuild a life from the ruins of public humiliation, the grace with which she inhabited her diminished circumstances without bitterness or complaint, and he knew, standing there in the winter cold with his breath misting before him, that he could not let her go, could not watch her slip away into some other position in some other household, could not return to the grey existence he had inhabited before she brought colour back into his world. Yet he was not a fool, and he understood the complications, the power imbalance that made any declaration from him inherently coercive, because she was his employee and dependent upon him for her livelihood and security, and how could she refuse him without risking everything? And what if she felt obligated rather than genuinely willing? And the thought of trapping her in a marriage she did not truly want was unbearable. But then he remembered the way she looked at him sometimes, when she thought herself unobserved, the softness in her eyes, and the quick turn away as though catching herself in some forbidden act. And he remembered her hand trembling in his after Catherine's crisis, and he thought perhaps she might feel as he did, might want what he wanted, and even if society judged them, even if his sister and the gossips and the arbiters of propriety condemned the match, what did it matter against the possibility of genuine happiness, of authentic love, of a life lived in truth rather than in careful adherence to meaningless convention? And he found himself standing at the crest of the hill overlooking the manor, and the winter sun broke suddenly through the grey clouds, sending shafts of gold across the snow-covered landscape, and everything seemed to crystallize in that moment. He would speak to her, honestly and completely. He would make clear that she was free to refuse without consequence, but he would not hide his heart any longer, would not pretend that the love he felt was anything less than transformative. And with that decision made, Sebastian turned back toward the house, with purpose in his stride and hope, fragile but real, kindling in his chest like the first warmth of spring. Sebastian spent the following morning closeted in his study, making arrangements with an intensity of purpose that might have alarmed the household staff had they known its object, sending a footman to the village with instructions for the cook regarding an elaborate dinner, ordering wine brought up from the cellar, directing that the formal dining room be prepared with the best linens and the silver candelabra that had not been used since his wife's death. And when Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, inquired whether he was expecting important guests, he replied only that it was to be a private family dinner of some significance, and something in his expression prevented further questions, and by late afternoon the preparations were complete, and he went himself to the schoolroom where Eleanor was helping Catherine with watercolors, the winter light slanting through the tall windows and catching the copper in Eleanor's hair as she bent over the child's work, with that particular attention she brought to everything Catherine did. And when he cleared his throat, they both looked up, and he saw Eleanor's immediate wariness, the way her posture straightened defensively, and he gentled his voice as he said, "Catherine, Miss Hartwell, I would be honored if you would join me for dinner this evening in the formal dining room. I have arranged something of an occasion." And Catherine's face lit with instant delight as she cried, "Oh, Papa, truly? The formal dining room?" "Ah," and he smiled at his daughter and said, "Truly, darling, and I expect you in your best dress." And Catherine was already chattering about which ribbon she would wear, but Eleanor remained quiet, her dark eyes searching his face with an expression he could not quite read, hope and fear, and something almost like resignation, and he held her gaze for a moment, longer than strictly necessary, and said softly, "Please, Eleanor, it would mean a great deal to me." And she nodded once, a small, precise movement, and whispered, "Of course, Your Grace." And he had to stop himself from correcting her, from saying that he wanted his name from her lips, not his title, but that would come, he hoped, that would come. The dinner itself began at 8, and when Eleanor entered the dining room in a dress of deep blue silk that she must have saved from her former life, her hair dressed simply but elegantly, Sebastian felt his breath catch because she was beautiful, had always been beautiful, but now there was something luminous about her, a quality of barely suppressed emotion that made her radiant. And Catherine was already seated and practically vibrating with excitement, clearly privy to some secret that made her giddy. And Sebastian seated Eleanor himself, and their hands touched briefly, and he felt her tremble, and the meal proceeded with a strange, dreamlike quality, the candles casting golden light across the polished table, the food exquisite but largely untasted, and Sebastian found himself speaking of courage, of the necessity of living according to one's own truth, rather than according to the expectations of others, of how he had spent too many years in the shadow of duty without joy. And Eleanor listened with her eyes fixed on his face and her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and he spoke of love, of how when it was genuine it transformed everything it touched, made the previously impossible suddenly essential, gave meaning to all that had been mere existence. And Catherine watched them both with bright knowing eyes, And finally Sebastian said gently, "Catherine, darling, it is time for bed." And Catherine rose obediently, but not before throwing her arms around Eleanor and whispering something that made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears. And then it was just the two of them, the candles burning low, the vast room suddenly intimate. And Eleanor looked at him with such naked vulnerability that Sebastian knew he could wait no longer, that the moment he had been building toward had finally, irrevocably, arrived. Sebastian rose from his chair and moved around the table with deliberate slowness, giving Eleanor time to flee if she wished, but she remained seated, her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles showed white, and he took the chair beside hers rather than looming over her, wanting this to be a conversation between equals despite everything that made equality between them structurally impossible. And he began quietly, his voice rough with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "Eleanor, I must speak to you with complete honesty, and I beg you to listen to the end before you respond, because what I have to say will alter everything between us, and I need you to understand the fullness of it before you make any decision." And she turned to face him, her dark eyes wide and luminous in the candlelight, and he continued, "These past months you have transformed this house, you have transformed my daughter, and you have transformed me. Though I suspect you do not realize the extent of it, I was a dead man when you arrived, Eleanor, going through the prescribed motions of living without any true engagement with life itself. My marriage was one of duty and expectation, and while I respected my late wife, we were never truly companions of the heart. And after she died, I thought myself incapable of the kind of love I had read about in books, the kind that consumes and completes and makes everything else pale by comparison. And then you came with your quiet strength and your wounded dignity and your extraordinary capacity for love, and I watched you heal my daughter with patience and genuine care. And I listened to you speak of literature and philosophy with an intelligence that challenged and delighted me, and I saw the courage it took for you to rebuild a life from ruins that were not of your making. And somewhere in all of that watching and listening and seeing, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you." He saw her inhale sharply, saw tears spill over her lashes, but he pressed on because he needed her to understand all of it. "I know the impossible position this puts you in. I know that you are my employee and dependent upon me for your security and livelihood. And I know that any proposal from me carries an inherent coercion, because how can you refuse without risking everything? And that knowledge has tormented me, Eleanor, because the last thing I want is to trap you or force you into something you do not genuinely desire, but I cannot continue as we are, pretending that what I feel is merely regard or respect or gratitude, when the truth is that I love you with an intensity that frightens me. I love your mind and your heart and your spirit. I love the way you bite your lip when you are thinking, and the way you listen as though every word matters. I love your fierce loyalty and your gentle strength, and I want, more than I have ever wanted anything, to spend the rest of my life loving you if you will permit it." And now he reached for her hands, still clasped in her lap, and covered them with his own, feeling how they trembled. "Miss Hartwell, Eleanor, I am asking you with full knowledge of the power imbalance between us, and with absolute assurance that you may refuse me without any consequence to your position here or your relationship with Catherine, but I am asking because I must, because a life without you in it fully and completely is no longer a life I wish to live. Will you consent to be my wife? Will you do me the extraordinary honor of allowing me to love you openly, for all the world to see?" Eleanor stared at him through her tears, her mouth opening and closing without sound, and finally she whispered, "This cannot be real. You cannot mean this. I am a ruined woman, a governess. I have nothing to bring to such a union. Surely this is some terrible jest." And Sebastian tightened his grip on her hands and said with fierce intensity, "It is no jest. I have never been more serious about anything in my life, and you are not ruined, Eleanor. You are remarkable. The scandal that drove you here revealed the smallness of those who judged you, not any failing in yourself. And as for what you bring everything. You bring life and love and meaning. You bring the future I thought I had lost." And he watched as her walls crumbled, as belief slowly dawned in her eyes, and she whispered, "I love you. I have loved you for months, though I knew it was impossible and foolish and dangerous. I love you, Sebastian." And hearing his name from her lips unlocked something in his chest, and he pulled her gently into his arms and felt her sob against his shoulder, all the fear and hope and desperate longing pouring out, and when she finally raised her face to his, he asked once more, "Will you marry me, Eleanor?" And through her tears she smiled, radiant and transforming, and breathed, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." And when he kissed her, it felt like resurrection, like spring after endless winter, like coming home to a place he had never known existed but had been searching for all his life. The engagement was announced in early March, when the first tentative signs of spring began to appear in the gardens of Thornfield Manor, crocuses pushing through the last remnants of snow with a determination that Eleanor found metaphorically appropriate. And the response from society was precisely as predictable as it was vicious. The same people who had ostracized Eleanor 2 years prior, now turning their judgment upon Sebastian with gleeful moral outrage. How could a duke of his standing marry a governess, a woman of ruined reputation, a nobody with nothing? And former friends, who had offered their tepid condolences after his first wife's death, now wrote letters dripping with concern for his judgment and his daughter's welfare, suggesting that grief had clearly addled his faculties, that he was making a catastrophic error that would destroy his family's good name. And Eleanor read these letters when Sebastian left them carelessly on his desk, not to hide them but because they meant so little to him they were not worth the effort of concealment, and each cruel word landed on her heart like a stone, the old shame rising up to whisper that they were right, and that she was ruining him, that her love was a selfish destruction of everything he had built. And one morning she found him in the library and said with careful control, "Sebastian, perhaps we should reconsider the damage to your reputation, to Catherine's prospects. I cannot bear to be the cause of your diminishment." And he looked up from his correspondence with such fierce intensity that she took a step backward, and he crossed to her in 3 strides and took her face between his hands and said, "Eleanor, listen to me. You are not ruining my reputation. You are giving me a life worth living. These people who judge us so harshly are the same ones who would have me spend the rest of my existence in cold duty, marrying some appropriate woman I do not love, raising Catherine in the same emotional wasteland I inhabited before you came, and I will not do it. I will not sacrifice the most genuine thing I have ever known for the approval of people whose opinions I do not value. Do you understand me?" And she nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face, and he kissed her forehead and murmured, "We will face them together, and we will be happy in spite of them, and eventually some will come around and others will not, and none of it will matter because we will have each other." And slowly, with the steady accumulation of small moments, Eleanor began to believe him, began to walk through the manor, not as a governess, stealing moments above her station, but as the future Duchess, learning the management of the household from Mrs. Henderson, who had softened considerably since the engagement and now treated Eleanor with cautious respect, sitting at Sebastian's right hand at dinner and expressing opinions about the estate's management, allowing Catherine to call her Eleanor rather than Miss Hartwell, in preparation for the day she might be called something closer still. And Sebastian was unwavering in his public devotion, making a point of escorting her on his arm when they attended church, introducing her to visitors as his betrothed, with such evident pride that some of the more flexible members of society began to reconsider their censure, reasoning that if the Duke was so certain, then perhaps there was more to Miss Hartwell than the scandal suggested. And Catherine was incandescent with joy, telling anyone who would listen that she was gaining a mother who loved her. And in the evenings when Eleanor still sometimes fell into doubt, Sebastian would take her hand and remind her that love, true love, was worth any price society might demand. And gradually, as winter yielded fully to spring, Eleanor began to inhabit her new role, not with the tentative uncertainty of someone waiting to be cast out, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally, impossibly, come home. The wedding took place on a mild morning in late April, when the gardens of Thornfield Manor were alive with the soft colors of spring, cherry blossoms drifting like snow across the lawn, and the air carrying the scent of earth and new growth. And though Sebastian had offered Eleanor a grand ceremony in London, with all the attendant spectacle befitting a duke's marriage, she had quietly requested something smaller, more intimate, something that felt true to what they had found together, rather than a performance for people whose opinions had never protected her when she needed protection. And so the ceremony was arranged in the manor's small chapel, with only Catherine and Mrs. Henderson, and a handful of servants who had come to genuinely care for Eleanor, along with Sebastian's sister, who had, after considerable soul-searching, decided that her brother's happiness mattered more than society's approval, and the vicar, who had known Sebastian since childhood and who conducted the service with sincere warmth rather than grudging duty. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk, simple in its lines but exquisitely made, her dark hair arranged in soft curls with a few apple blossoms tucked among them, and when Sebastian saw her walking toward him down the short aisle, with Catherine preceding her as flower girl scattering rose petals with solemn concentration, his expression transformed into something so openly adoring that several witnesses found themselves wiping away tears, because here was a man who had been dead to life itself and was now so evidently, luminously alive. The vows they exchanged were traditional in form, but weighted with meaning that only they fully understood. When Eleanor promised to honor and cherish him, she was promising to see him fully and to recognize the man beneath the title. And when Sebastian promised to love and protect her, he was promising to stand between her and every judgment, every cruelty, to be the shelter she had never had. And when he said, "I promise to honor your courage, to deserve the gift you have given me, and to build with you a life of genuine joy," his voice broke slightly and Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. And the vicar pronounced them husband and wife with evident satisfaction, and Sebastian kissed his bride with a tenderness that spoke of reverence as much as passion. And Catherine launched herself at them both, wrapping her arms around their legs and crying, "Now we are a proper family," which made everyone laugh through their tears. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the morning room, where Eleanor had once taken her solitary meals as governess, but now the space was transformed with flowers and sunlight, and a table laden with delicacies, and the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and shared stories, and Eleanor sat beside her husband, still adjusting to the strangeness and wonder of that word, and caught his eye, and saw reflected there the same profound gratitude she felt. Not gratitude to society for accepting them, because society largely had not, but gratitude to each other for the courage to reach across the barriers that should have kept them apart. Gratitude for love that had healed wounds both had thought permanent, and as the breakfast concluded and guests prepared to depart, Sebastian took Eleanor's hand and brought it to his lips and murmured, "Happy, my love?" And she smiled, radiant and certain, and answered, "More than I ever imagined possible." And in that moment, she understood that redemption had come not through the world's forgiveness, but through the simple, revolutionary act of being genuinely loved and choosing to believe herself worthy of it. 5 years had passed since that April wedding, 5 years that had transformed Thornfield Manor from a place of cold duty and lingering grief into a home alive with warmth and laughter, and on a golden afternoon in early summer, Eleanor stood in the garden, watching her husband Sebastian chase their youngest child, a boy of 3 named Thomas, between the rose bushes, while their daughter Anne, just turned 4, squealed with delight from her perch on the garden bench, and Catherine, now 16 and poised on the edge of young womanhood, sat beside Eleanor, sketching the scene with the considerable artistic talent that had first revealed itself in those early lessons years ago. And she looked up from her work and said, "Mama, do you think Papa realizes he has leaves in his hair?" And Eleanor laughed, the sound coming easily, naturally, so different from the careful, measured responses of her governess days, and answered, "I suspect he does not care in the slightest." And indeed, Sebastian looked utterly unburdened by ducal dignity as he scooped Thomas into his arms and spun him around, the child's laughter ringing across the gardens like bells, and Eleanor felt the familiar swell of gratitude that still caught her by surprise, even after 5 years of marriage, gratitude for this impossible life that had grown from the ashes of her ruin, and she reached over to squeeze Catherine's hand, this girl who was not hers by blood, but was absolutely hers by love, who had chosen months ago to call her Mama rather than Eleanor, and who signed her letters home from the brief visits to friends as "Your devoted daughter, Catherine," and the girl squeezed back, sharing a smile of perfect understanding before returning to her sketch. The manor itself bore evidence of transformation in every room, the heavy drapes that had blocked light replaced with shears that let the sun stream through, fresh flowers in every hallway, the sound of children's footsteps and voices where once there had been only oppressive silence, and Eleanor had slowly made her mark not just as Duchess, but as a woman determined to use her position for something meaningful. And 2 years ago, She had established a small school on the estate grounds for girls of reduced circumstances, daughters of gentlewomen who had fallen on hard times, offering them education and skills so they might support themselves with dignity, rather than face the limited, desperate options Eleanor herself had known. And Sebastian had supported the project without hesitation, had in fact told visitors with evident pride that his wife had taught him that love and opportunity were not finite resources to be hoarded, but infinite gifts that grew in the giving. She had overheard him just that morning speaking with the vicar, who had come to discuss parish business. And the vicar had remarked on the change in Thornfield, how the entire atmosphere had shifted, and Sebastian had said, "My wife has taught me that a heart can expand infinitely if one has the courage to let it. I thought I had no more room for love after losing my first wife, but Eleanor showed me that love does not replace love, it multiplies it, and I am wealthier now in every way that matters than I have ever been." And Eleanor, passing in the corridor, had paused unseen, tears pricking her eyes as they still did when confronted with evidence of this extraordinary gift she had been given. And now Sebastian approached, carrying a giggling Thomas, Anne toddling beside them, and he met Eleanor's gaze with that look of absolute devotion that never failed to make her breath catch. And he said, "Your family requires your attention, your grace. There is a dispute about whether we should have strawberry tarts or lemon cakes with tea." And Eleanor rose, accepting Thomas into her arms and feeling his small warm weight settle against her, and answered, "I believe this requires a family council." And together they walked toward the house, Catherine gathering her sketching materials to follow, and Eleanor thought, as she had thought countless times before, that this life, this impossible, beautiful life, was so far beyond what she had imagined. That grey autumn afternoon, when she had first arrived at Thornfield, believing her story was effectively over, and she understood now that endings were sometimes simply beginnings in disguise, waiting for courage and love to reveal them as such.